Well, good morning, everyone. It's the top of the hour, so I'm going to get started. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Deborah Lawler, and I'm the Federal Liaison between the WestFAST and the Western States Water Council, and also host of today's presentation. This webinar will be recorded and posted to the WestFAST tab found at the Western States Water Council's webpage at westernstateswater.org. Today, we're going to hear about Reclamation's transportation program. We're going to hear from Daniel Staton. Daniel is the Transportation Program Manager with the Asset Management Division at the Bureau of Reclamation out of Denver, Colorado. Before I hand it over to Daniel, I wanted to let you know that we will take questions at the end of today's presentation. You'll be able to either use the chat feature or unmute yourself. If as we go along you do have questions, please don't hesitate to capture them in the chat and I'll be happy to read them aloud at the end of the presentation. So with that, I'm turning it over to you, Dan.
All right, thanks, Deb. Good morning, everyone. Like Deb mentioned, I'm Dan Staton. I work in the Asset Management Division in Denver, and I'm the Transportation Program Manager for Reclamation. So I'm going to talk to you today about our transportation program. Really, the emphasis is going to be how the transportation program is helping us with our partnerships. We have a lot of different partnerships across the West, and transportation programs really playing a key role in helping with those partnerships as our transportation program matures. All right. So a few topics today. I'll give you a little background on our transportation program, how it's evolved over the last 5 or 6 years. And we'll get into the 4 main programs that we have. These are all Federal Highways Administration programs. So many of the other federal land management agencies on the call today are involved with these programs. I'll give you some information on how Reclamation is utilizing these programs. So the first one's Federal Lands Transportation Program, FLTP. Then we have the Federal Lands Access Program, or FLAP. And then we have the Emergency Relief for Federally Owned Roads, ERFO program. And then finally, the Federal Lands Planning Program, FLPP. And then at the end, I'll talk a little bit about our road and bridge inventory and how we're using that to help educate our partners and share information on the transportation needs that we have. So a little background on Reclamation's transportation program. We are the newest partner to the Federal Lands Transportation Program. We were added in fiscal year 16 through the Fixing America's Surface Transportation Act, the FAST Act. So before that, we received a very small amount of funding, primarily just for bridge inspections, fiscal year 15 and before. Then you can see in the bottom, in fiscal year 16, that's when we started receiving our Federal Lands Transportation Program funds, FLTP. So those are our construction funds that we can use to rehabilitate or construct transportation assets. And then the FLPP is our planning funds that we can use for a number of different activities. I'll talk about that in more detail later on. But you can kind of see from the chart, the table there, the funding has steadily grown over time. And the influx of funding has really helped us mature our transportation program, focus on our inventories, focus on what data we're capturing and how we're sharing that data with our partners. So Reclamation, our agency is really built on partnerships. And we were authorized in 1902. Any water project we had, we had to have that partnership with a local non-federal agency. That partnership was established formally through a contract or our repayment contracts and our long-term operation and maintenance contracts. And then that was extended to the recreation side as well. When some of the newer recreation authorities came on and mid-century, we used a similar mentality where we established managing partner agreements with many times non-federal agencies, but sometimes federal agencies as well, to manage recreation around our reclamation water projects. And so the transportation program is really, I think, helping with some of those partnerships. We'll talk about it throughout the presentation today, but we have about 2,800 miles of public roads, about 300 public bridges, and 2/3 of all those transportation assets are maintained by someone else. So you can quickly see that our partners are critical in order for Reclamation to have an effective transportation program. So these various funding programs are helping us work with our partners, figure out what our priorities are, figure out where our shared interests are to help us prioritize our projects. Okay, the first program I'm talking to you about is Federal Lands Transportation Program, FLTP. This is kind of the main central program for Reclamation. Again, the funding does come from federal highways. Reclamation gets about $7.5 million a year. We are a competing partner with BLM and Corps of Engineers, which means there's a pot of money. It's about $25 million a year that the agencies compete for based on federal highways requirements. And some of the other partners like Park Service, they're the major player. They get about 270 or so million a year. And then Forest Service and Fish and Wildlife have dedicated funds as well. But the goal of FLTP is really to get the public approve public access, and so have to go to publicly accessible transportation feature. The key for us is that our transferred works and our managing partner assets are eligible. So what I mean by that is, I mentioned 2/3 of our assets are maintained by someone else. So on the irrigation side, the water project side, we have anytime we have a long-term agreement with someone, we call that a transferred works, meaning Reclamation still has ownership of the asset, but we have a long-term contract with a non-federal partner for operation and maintenance. So they're responsible for maintenance. And similar for recreation as well, that we have long-term managing partner agreements with typically non-federal entities, and those assets are owned by Reclamation, but they're maintained by our partners. Moving on, so the main requirements for FLTP, so it does need to go to transportation assets. So typically that's roads, bridges, trails, boat ramps are also eligible. So we've done a number of projects on boat ramps, accessing our reservoirs. They do be owned by Reclamation, but they can be maintained by our partners. Like I mentioned, open to the public. And then the key is Reclamation is really controls where this funding goes. So our field offices, our area offices, they'll submit applications for funding. Those will come to Denver, to headquarters, and we have a team that evaluates all those projects on set criteria. And the highest rated projects are the ones that get funded. We have a lot more needs than we're able to fund, so we have to prioritize where the funding goes. FLTP, it can fund 100% of the project. So we'll talk about Federal Lands Access Program next. That one's a little different because it does require a match. So we're really trying to focus on, we have such limited funds. How do we work with our partners better to extend that funds? How do we work together where our partners bring some funding to the table, we bring funding to the table? How do we get more work done? How do we go after Federal Lands Access Program funding as well? And just trying to look for ways to meet the transportation needs that we have. It really starts with communication at the local level, that our area offices need to be coordinating with our partners and just talking about what their needs are, what roads are the most critical for them to have good access. Is there additional access that's needed in certain areas? And for high priorities for both agencies. If Reclamation's main access road to our dam and power plant is also the main access to our partners' recreation site, maybe that's a high priority road for both agencies. It would be a great candidate to get funded. I mentioned the Reclamation field offices. They do need to submit the application, but we are encouraging our partners to work directly with our local offices to help with that application. So here's an example project that we have. So I mentioned our formal partnerships, the ones that are established through contract, long-term repayment contracts, operation and maintenance contracts, or long-term managing partner agreements. So those are formal. They're established, by a contract. Obviously there's a good partnership there behind the scenes too, but there is some formal partnership. And then we have many other partnerships that are more informal, or it's based on vicinity, location. And so this is a good example. This is a project at Crystal Dam, Reclamation Dam, and the access road getting down to it, East Portal Road. This project is within the Black Canyon of the Gunnison National, and this road here is one of the steepest paved roads in Colorado. Reclamation constructed this road in the 70s in order to build Crystal Dam and get access to our power plant and dam. But there's also a Park Service campground at the bottom. One of our first projects for Reclamation in 1905 was the Gunnison Tunnel that took water from the Gunnison River to the Padre Valley, and that's also at the bottom. Water users use this road daily to operation and maintenance of the tunnel. Reclamation is responsible for this road. You can kind of see from the picture, the road is in very rough shape. It has not had a rehabilitation project since it was constructed. That combined with the extremely steep slopes, it needs a lot of work. You can kind of see in this area and along the road, there's some pretty steep rock cuts, and there's some unstable slopes that need to be mitigated. So the project involved repaving the road and then also mitigating the highest rockfall hazards that we have along the road. So it's really a great partnership project for Reclamation and Park Service, and then also for our irrigation district, our water user, that brings water to the Gunnison Tunnel at the bottom of the canyon. And this is one of our biggest FLTP projects. This is a $5 million project that will be constructed later this summer. Another example is Yellowtail Dam in Montana. Reclamation built the dam, and instead of establishing a non-federal managing partner agreement for recreation, this one was turned over jurisdictionally to the Park Service for recreation. So this is the Bighorn Canyon National Recreation Area that Park Service is responsible for. But the roads, there's joint responsibility. Reclamation has maintenance responsibility, and so does Park Service for the roads that access the dam and the visitor center. There's not a whole lot of details on what the percentage share is. It just says that both agencies are responsible, and so FLTP kind of brought the agencies together to start thinking about, okay, what do we need to get done here? How do we share the costs? How do we work together? What needs does each agency have? Project was recently funded for construction in fiscal year 23, about a $4.5 million job for pavement preservation and also guardrail improvements. So, even if it's other federal agencies, many of the folks on the call, there's a lot of overlap with Reclamation and other federal agencies. We're right next to, Fish and Wildlife, Forest Service, and there's a lot of opportunity for us to work together. And transportation is one of those areas where we can really work together. All right, moving over to Federal Lands Access Program, FLAP. This one is similar to FLTP. Some of the main differences are reclamation, doesn't control where the funding goes. That's controlled by federal highways. This program has about $250 million a year, and the funding is divided up for each state based on how much federal land and federal roads are in that state. So the states in the West receive the most funding based on the large amount of federal land and federal roads in those states. The other key difference is FLAP funding has to go to non-federal entities. It goes to non-federal maintain the transportation asset in order to receive funding. And areas with high visitation or high economic generation are prioritized. So for reclamation, again, we only get $7.5 million a year for transportation. It's funding is huge for us. It's very helpful, but we have a whole lot more needs than that. And so we're really looking to FLAP to help fulfill some of those needs. 2/3 of our assets are essentially eligible for FLTP and FLAP because reclamation is the owner and they're maintained by a non-federal entity. So it's a good way to look for both programs for potential needs. So a lot of the same requirements are the same. It goes to transportation assets. The key one is it's owned or maintained. So that means all of our transferred works, all of our managing partner assets are eligible for FLAP funding and FLTP, and that's huge. Most as other federal agencies don't have that. Usually they, if they own it, they're responsible for maintenance, and so they pretty much just have to rely on their FLTP. But for reclamation, due to all our partnerships, we can utilize both FLTP and FLAP for the majority of our roads. It doesn't need to be open to the public, and then it needs to be around or accessing federal land. For FLTP, I said that reclamation submits the application. For FLAP, it's the non-federal partner that submits the application. And there is a match requirement that varies in each state. So for a state that might have a 10% match, if you are looking for $1 million of funding, you're going to have to come up with $100,000 on your own. We'll talk a little bit more on strategies to fund that match. So what does reclamation do? We don't have a direct say in what projects get funded. That is determined by a 3-person team in each state. Federal Highways leads that, and then they have typically a state DOT member, and then a local organization, local government agency member as well. But reclamation does get a serve on the technical advisory group. This is made up of each federal agency present in the state. So many of the folks on the call today, you have memberships on the TAG, a technical advisory group as well. And even though we don't get a vote directly, we get to help prioritize which projects, the big benefit to federal agencies, federal land, and then specifically for us for reclamation. So that's a good opportunity where if we have that good coordination and collaboration with our partners beforehand, then we can help advocate for their projects during the technical advisory group. So I mentioned coordination already. We also have a letter of support. So that comes from our area manager at the local level, and that is what indicates our support for the project. And that's a minimum. We have to write the letter of support, but there's also a lot of other ways we can show the support. A good way is by providing our own funds. We'll talk about that here in a little bit. This table represents some of the the higher FLAP projects that we've had. This isn't all of them. We've had about 90 million in FLAP funding come to Reclamation in the last 8 years or so. But just I wanted to highlight a few of them. Elephant Butte, this is in New Mexico. We'll talk about this on the next slide. So I'll save that for the next slide. Cottonwood Campground Bridge, that's actually the previous picture here. So this is maintained by New Mexico State Parks. It's a campground Reclamation owns downstream of Navajo Reservoir that New Mexico State Parks is responsible for. And there's this low water crossing as the only access road, and you can tell that routinely gets washed out, and during flood situations, it can strand the public at the campground. So we submitted or our partner submitted a FLAP application for building a new bridge to access that campground due to the safety concern. So that was funded for $3 million. Lake Nighthorse, that's City of Durango is our partner there, and that's general road and parking rehabilitation. Similar for Horsetooth and Carter Lake in Colorado, our partner is Larimer County there. They submitted a proposal, received $10 million in FLAP funding. Lake Thunderbird, that's in Oklahoma. So this is one where Reclamation provided the matching funds through our Federal Lands Transportation Program. So the match requirement was 20%. So we provided $300,000, and then our partner Oklahoma Tourism was able to secure the remaining FLAP funds needed for the project. We also have Wyoming and Alcova Dam, and some projects in Nebraska, Calamus Reservoir and Cheney Reservoir. So really the 17 Western states that Reclamation is involved in, majority of those have had FLAP projects to various degrees. I'm really trying to get more FLAP projects in the future too. So here's the Elephant Butte project I was mentioning. So this New Mexico State Parks is the partner as well. It's along the west side of Elephant Butte Reservoir, very long access road, and there's many arroyos that it crosses. And the culverts along the road currently are severely undersized, meaning the road washes out a lot of debris gets piled up on the road. And so Reclamation had done some studies that identified these 4 structures needed to be replaced, and the size greatly increased. So this is a $12 million job. You kind of put yourself in a state park organization. How are they supposed to fund that? That's a pretty large chunk for the access road. And so that's where we worked with our partner. This is another one where we used FLTP funds for the matching requirement. So the first thing we did was our Albuquerque area office submitted the FLAP or the FLTP for the matching funds, the $1 million in match. They were successful. Funds were set aside for that. And then New Mexico State Parks took that to the Federal Lands Access Program application, and they submitted for the full $12 million using the $1 million in FLTP as a match. So whenever Federal Highway sees that, that's, we're putting, actions speak louder than words. So Reclamation is by contributing our own funds, that speaks a whole lot more than just a letter of support. So not always, but that's a good indicator, a good way to get FLAP projects funded. So we're trying to focus on that in the future. We've had some success with it so far. Here's Horsetooth and Carter Lake. I mentioned this one briefly. This is Larimer County. Larimer County funded this on their own. So Reclamation didn't provide any funds, but still from their perspective, $10 million, they only have to fund $1 million of that. So it's still a huge help for them, and a good way to get some of their public access needs funded. So what are our partners responsible for? Really just communication. You'll see that a lot in this presentation, that we just need to communicate better. Quite frankly, a lot of our partners are still trying to educate themselves on FLAP. They don't know about it yet. So we've focused a lot on education in the last 5 years, trying to figure out what we need, what our partners need, how they can work with us better, and just improve that coordination at the local level so they can identify projects of mutual interest. And then ultimately, the non-federal entity does need to write the application. Here's another example. This one we are hopeful for. It's the FLAP call is coming up in a couple of months, so we're not sure if it's going to be funded yet or not. But this is a good example of that partnership, mutual need. This is a Reclamation-owned bridge. It is structurally deficient. It's in poor condition. It's over 100 years old. We built it, and our partner maintains a local irrigation district. It used to carry a flume for the canal across the river. Many decades ago, the irrigation district put a siphon in under the river, so the bridge is no longer carrying the water, but it's still their only access to both sides of the river. It's torn down or unusable. The detour would be about 50 miles going around. There's also a lot of public use on the BLM land on the other side of this bridge. And so there's that public need as well. So the first thing the area office did was really coordinate with a partner, and they identified this many years ago as a mutual need for both agencies. The irrigation district started investing their own funds into studies to figure out what needed to be done with this bridge. How can we replace it? What's the best spot for a new bridge? Then they took that to the area office, and the area office submitted a FLTP proposal for the FLAP match. So this replacing this bridge, it's a 200-foot long bridge, pretty big bridge. It's about a $13 million project, and so just the match is pretty sizable. It's about 1.7 million that's needed. So they were successful. FLTP funds were set aside, and then the FLAP call for Montana is coming up in a couple months. So we'll see what happens with that. But that's another example of how it can have direct benefits to irrigation districts. So these are the 17 western states that Reclamation is involved in. And it's the annual FLAP amount in each fund, in each state. The FLAP call for projects is every 3 years. So you multiply that number by 3, and that's roughly how much the call for projects is. So Arizona, they just did theirs earlier this year, and they were seeking 25 to 30 million in funding. We have a couple coming up. California is a big one that's opening this month. A couple, Washington, Wyoming are open right now as well. And you can see, Oklahoma, they only get 1.2 million. Kansas, less than 1 million. Nebraska, less than 1 million. But that slide I showed you a couple slides ago, you could see we got a project in each of those states because there's not a whole lot of other federal land there that really limits the applications. And so Reclamation still has some good projects that our partners are responsible for in those states. So even if your state doesn't have a whole lot of funds, there's still good opportunity for good projects there. You can find more information on Federal Highway's website. You can just search for Federal Lands Access Program and it comes right up. You can click on the map of the US for your state and you can get more information on when the next call for projects is, what's your match requirement, who's the point of contact, things like that. It'll also give you more details on who the technical advisory group is for that state. So you can see, Reclamation should have a tag member in every state, and that's a great person to reach out to and strategize with, figure out what the plan is to get your project funded. And then, we mentioned this already, just 2/3 of our assets. I keep saying it, but it's huge for FLTP and FLAP. 2/3 of our assets are maintained by someone else. That opens up a lot of funding possibilities. We could use FLTP, we can use FLAP, we can use Reclamation appropriated dollars, we could use partner funds. Just looking at FLTP, we're not going to have enough money to fund all our needs. So we have to really start being creative, look for ways to leverage our funds and help our partners, help Reclamation out, but just look for really strategize what's the best way to get a project funded, what's the timing that's needed. And we're really focusing on using FLTP funds to cover the match. We've been successful in New Mexico and Oklahoma. I mentioned the Montana one coming up. We also have one in California where we provided FLTP funds at Lake Berryessa, and we're going to see if Napa County is successful in the FLAP application. So that's a big area that we're focusing on. What's the steps? Number one, just communication. Broken record on that, but we just need to communicate better. There's a lot of overlap at the local level, and most of our partners are familiar with FLTP and FLAP now, but there's still some, like I mentioned, that we had our FLTP call for projects in August, and we had one of our area offices receive funding for the first time because that was the first time they had ever heard about FLTP. So we're still trying to educate people and make sure that they know this opportunity is out there. Work on the strategy, figure out how you're going to fund the project. And then it's always good to look for the FLTP funds first. You need to have those funds secured before you go to the Federal Lands Access Program call for projects. And then the non-federal partner applies for the FLAP funds, hopefully using the FLTP funds as a match. So here's of the Western states showing the transportation projects that have been funded. So the blue triangles, those are the Federal Lands Access Program projects involving reclamation. And then the purple circles are the Federal Lands Transportation Program projects. And then right now we only have two, but the ones we're focusing on are those orange squares where we use FLTP to help cover the match for FLAP. So we hope to get a lot more orange squares in the future. All right, I will halfway through time, so I'll kind of go through the last couple programs. FLTP and FLAP are really the main ones I wanted to talk with you about, but also briefly talk about ERFO. This is our emergency relief for federally owned roads. This is disaster funding that Federal Highways provides for federally owned roads that are damaged during disasters. Transferred works and managing partner assets are eligible for this. And so this is the big one where we need education. We need our partners to know about it. There's a lot of requirements that we won't get into today, you know, which storms qualify. Typically it's 25-year storm events and bigger, but there's a lot of variance there. The biggest thing is just that notification. When damage does happen at the local level, you know, try to get that communication started through reclamation so we can start working with Federal Highways to see if it qualifies for funding. So this just talks about, obviously, when the disaster happens, the last thing on your mind is ERFO funding, and that's definitely, we don't need to be thinking about ERFO funding right then. You know, there's other higher priorities when the disaster is happening. But once things calm down a little bit, you're starting to do emergency repairs. You know, that's when it's a good idea to start taking pictures, start doing some documentation. You're not going to get ERFO funding the day after, but you might get ERFO funding 6 months later that would reimburse you for the funds you spent the day after. So it's good to have good documentation on what you spent in case you do get ERFO funding that could reimburse all those expenses you had. Notifications, the big one. In order to start the process to see if you get funding, we need notification, typically within 40 days of the disaster happening. What we found is many of our partners, can you guys hear me? Can you hear me?
You're breaking up a little bit, Dan.
Okay. Sorry, probably the kids on the Zoom call downstairs. Sorry about that. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay.
I kind of missed the days of when you need to be notified.
Okay. Yeah, so it's roughly 45 days that Federal Highways needs to know when that damage happens. And what we found is most of our partners, they think that they're on their own, that they're responsible for operation and maintenance. So why should Reclamation know if their road washed out? And they don't know about IRFO, so they don't see the benefit of really reaching out to Reclamation so we can start this communication process with Federal Highways to see if our partner could get IRFO funding. And so we're really trying to focus on that, just that notification. When the disaster happens, contact your local Reclamation office and really start the communication process. So this chart's just showing kind of in blue bars is the amount of IRFO funding for each federal agency over the last 5 years, and then the orange circles, that is the mileage for each agency. So just trying to show that Reclamation, we don't have a whole lot of road miles, but we hardly get any IRFO funding, and it's really because of that notification. We're trying to focus on notifying, making sure our partners are aware of this, so we can try to provide assistance when that disaster does happen. You never know when it might happen, so the best way to get prepared is just to know what to do in case your road does wash out, your bridge collapses, or whatever happens. We want to make sure our partners are aware of this. Yeah, we talked about the notification. We've only had 2 events in Reclamation. We've had a lot more roads wash out than just 2, but it's just the notification. We're a newer partner to IRFO, and so trying to make sure everyone knows what to do if that happens. So there's a lot of good IRFO trainings that we're getting our folks educated on. And then moving over to Federal Land Planning Program, not going to touch on a whole lot here, just wanted to mention it, that the funding we get primarily funds our bridge inspection program, and then we also fund our road inventory and condition assessments. We're trying to use this information to help our partners. So I'll talk about that over the next slides. We also fund our Federal Land Access Program coordination, FLTP, proposal development, and various transportation planning efforts. So this is our bridge inventory. We have over 7,000 structures in our bridge inventory. That doesn't mean we're responsible for 7,000. The majority of those are what we call type 3 bridges that cross a reclamation facility, typically a canal, but someone else owns them. So there's not a whole lot we need to do with these structures, but we need to know about them in case they're impacting our ability to deliver water. So we track all those structures, but the main ones we focus on are the green dots, which are type 1 bridges. Those are the 300 type 1 bridges that are open to the public. We have to report to Federal Highways. And then the blue ones are about 1,200 non-public bridges that Reclamation owns that aren't open to public vehicles. So those are the big ones. But just looking at the maintenance responsibility, a lot of, same with bridges, a lot of the bridges are maintained by someone else, and there's a lot of good opportunity to have our type 1 bridges funded through FLTP, FLAP, or even IRFO if something happens at that bridge. All right, moving over to the road inventory. So this map is just showing all the roads we have, about 2,800 miles of roads throughout the West. This is new to us. So our first geospatial road inventory was developed in FY17. And over the last 3 years, we've focused on doing our first cycle of condition assessments. We're working with our partner, Federal Highways, to get boots on the ground to get condition information at all of our public roads. This really helps us with our planning efforts. We can get a network level awareness of what our road needs are, summarized by each partner. I'll show that in the next couple of slides, how our partners can really use this data. But we're excited about it. It's a really great tool for partnering to represent what our needs are for our roads. So this is just a couple snapshots from the road condition assessment reports we get back. So they're summarized by maintenance entity. So these are all Reclamation owned roads, but we have various partners that maintain the roads. So this is the Western Colorado Area Office report. You can see that Colorado Parks and Wildlife is a huge partner for us in all of Colorado. This report's just focusing on the western half. So our partner alone has $8 million in needs on their road. Those are direct road maintenance needs. And then you can look at some of our smaller partners like Pine River Irrigation District. You know, they're a smaller irrigation district, but they still have some significant roads that might be hard, or significant needs that might be harder for a smaller agency to fund. So by having this information, sharing it with our partners, we can start planning this out. You know, Pine River Irrigation District can look out 5 years, 10 years and say, okay, I don't have this money right now, but we can start setting aside some funds to do this roadway rehabilitation project in 5 years or 10 years. So it's really going to help us with planning with our partners. This is more of the detailed information. So this is one of the roads that Pine River Irrigation District is responsible for. You can tell the yellow here, that means it's in fair condition. This is a pavement condition rating. You can see when it was inspected, you know, what the surface type is, what the functional class is. That's the priority of the road, how important it is. And then we get other summary information. So you can see it's a 0.8 mile long road, and it's broken down into 2 segments. So the first segment's about half mile long, and it has a pavement condition rating of 73. That's based on this longitudinal cracking. We also have scores for, you know, patching, potholes. You can see what's driving the condition rating. And for this road, it's longitudinal cracking. Then we get a recommended treatment. It needs light rehabilitation. Here's the estimated cost. The last section of road is doing a little better. It only needs preventative maintenance. And here's the pavement condition rating. So this is really good information that we're starting to share with our partners. We're about halfway through the first cycle across Reclamation. We have Upper Colorado Basin region done and Lower Colorado Basin region. And then we're working on the other 3 regions right now. So this will be a great tool for our partners and for Reclamation to help start identifying, you know, what FLTP projects should we submit? What flat projects should we submit? So we're really looking forward to all of our partners having access to this data. So that is all the information I have today. Looks like there's a few questions in the chat that we can cover, and we'll open it up to others if there are questions. Deb, you want me to go through the questions in the chat first?
Yeah, so I captured some of these as we went along, and you might have answered them maybe afterwards, but I'll just go through the ones that I've posed real quick.
Okay.
So I said, you mentioned that Army Corps, Park Service, I think you said Forest Service, and maybe some others also have access to this federal transportation funds. So I'm wondering, are they ever pooled to address issues with partners, I guess? Those various pots of money.
We're trying to more and more. For other agencies, I think it's come up a few times, but each agency is kind of responsible for their own funding. And so if within each agency, those needs rise to the surface, and each agency has it as a high priority, then yeah, then they can get funded. Collectively, across the federal land management agencies, we're recognizing that there's a lot of overlap, and we're trying to do a better job of identifying those overlaps. Reclamation has a ton of them, where maybe Fish and Wildlife is responsible for the recreation, or BLM, or Park Service, or maybe we're just right next to each other. And my project is going to impact the Forest Service. So maybe instead of Forest Service doing another project a year later, maybe we can pool our funds together, give those to Federal Highways, and have Federal Highways deliver one project for us. So we can do a much better job of that, but I shared a couple examples where we're starting to do that.
Great. The next question I had, I actually think one of your maps answered the question, but I'll just throw it out there anyway. Where USBR has state partners, do you get good participation in these programs from the states? So does the state seem to be aware of the programs and utilize them? And I kind of guess that really came home in your map that you had, where there were 2 orange boxes where you want to get more, where they're utilizing both the FLTP and FLAP. Correct. So is it an awareness issue, do you think, or?
I think it is. New Mexico is a great example. The top 2 FLAP projects in the whole state, as far as ranking, were both reclamation projects submitted by New Mexico State Parks. So I think New Mexico State Parks is doing a great job. Colorado Parks and Wildlife, there's a lot of FLAP projects in Colorado. I don't think we had a whole lot come through in the last go around. So I think a lot of it is just different people coming and going with it in each agency. You know, maybe we had one person that was really knowledgeable in FLAP, and then maybe they cycled through and someone else is responsible for it now. But I would say across all of our states, there's definitely some improvement we could make with better coordination, especially with our state partners. You know, I mentioned that one of the members selecting the FLAP projects is typically a state DOT member or another state organization. And so where Reclamation does have a state partner, you'd think there'd be a lot of opportunity to have those projects funded. Some states we do, other states not so much. So I think we could do a better job.
Okay, great. Thanks. And then finally, one of your slides was talking about ERFO and the need for when there's maybe some sort of a flooding issue and a road being washed out, that it would be good to contact Reclamation. And I was wondering, does there need to be, does the road or the issue need to somehow be connected to a reclamation project for them to do that?
So we do need to own it. Reclamation needs to own it, but we don't have to have like a current construction project planned on it. But if it's not federally owned, then there's another program called just ER, emergency relief, that non-federal entities are eligible for. So that's where they'd have to go up through their state, and usually it requires a declaration or emergency declaration from the governor in order to qualify for ER funding. But for ERFO, we don't have to have the governor declaration. We just have to have enough widespread damage, adding up to 750,000 across all the federal agencies.
Okay, great. Okay, now another question coming in from Adil Abdullah out of the Western States Water Council. He's asking, is the bridge geospatial data publicly available?
Right now, it's not publicly available. We're doing coordinations within Reclamation with our RISE program. I think they've spoken to this group before, and we're trying to see what information we can share. There is some sensitive information that we can't share, but we're trying to figure out if there's a good way to make other information available. Right now it's not, but I expect sometime in the future, at least the dots on the map would be publicly accessible.
Thanks. Okay, any other questions out there? No? I think we're good to go, Dan. I really appreciate really appreciate your time today, and I appreciate everyone attending. And I guess that wraps it up.